Hello, BookTube, and welcome to ShakeTube 2019. This is an event put on by Lukash at Totally Pretentious, and Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and yours truly, in which we celebrate Shakespeare all month long. We've been doing it for years now, and it's a lot of fun. It has a special place in my heart as an event because it was in a ShakeTube video in 2017 that you all first made the acquaintance of a certain little bean, and I had only made her acquaintance a few days before. When she's on that video, I had no idea what was going to happen. I had no idea whether or not she was going to work out. No idea at all. I had one old, blind, lame dog at the time, and I wasn't sure that wasn't just going to turn ugly. It didn't. It didn't at all. And here she is still, and here I am. And in our approach to ShakeTube, Lukash and Jason and I are giving you a kind of a la carte approach here, because we're each doing different plays for the first 3 weeks of the month. So you can pick and choose as you please. Although, if we're putting in all the effort, I think the least you can do is watch all the videos, don't you? And then at the end, for the last week, for the grand finale of ShakeTube 2019, we will all be talking about the same play. We were voxering back and forth, as the kids do, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. I have read Shakespeare backwards and forwards. I have read Shakespeare many, many times. I have had one or two of you over the years of these videos notice a Shakespearean allusion, some turn of phrase of mine that is a Shakespearean allusion or an outright Shakespearean quote at length. And one of you, only one of you, you know who you are, a tenured academic in English studies, suddenly got the horrible impression, as she put it, I felt like the floor was shaking underneath me. She started to wonder in one video, oh my God, how many of these allusions are there? I caught one, and then one other in the same video, one other turn of phrase struck me as a little odd. So I Googled it, and it also was a Shakespeare allusion. Now I'm wondering if all of it is Shakespeare. It's not all Shakespeare allusions, but I have known Shakespeare. I have read him many, many times, and I've also taught him quite a bit. But I had no idea what to pick for my plays. Unfortunately, Lukash was there to step in and order me around. So he picked the three plays that I will do. And the first one of those is Coriolanus. And if you have ever taught this play to a room full of teenage boys, believe me, that's how you want to pronounce it. And this is a late play. This is, even if, Shakespearean scholars will, some of them, the worst of them, will go on and on about the certainty of the dates when nothing could be less certain. And there is no completely accurate way to date this play. But it seems, from the preponderance of evidence, to be a late play. It seems to be, to be 1610, 1605, something like that, somewhere in there, 1607, 1608, something like that. A fairly late play, and it's the story. I'm not sure if this isn't why maybe Lukash suggested it for me, just to get me going, but I'm going to try and control myself. It's about a thin-skinned megalomaniac who is loyal only to his own egotism and who is willing to betray his home country if it doesn't praise him highly enough. And in 2019... Well, anyway, it's about a mythical Roman figure, Gaius Marcius, who is a successful general, a hard ass, a typical Roman man of war, and who turns on Rome. This is all. I don't believe that any of it is true. I don't believe there ever was a Coriolanus. He gets his name. The name of the play, and his famous agnomen. He gets his famous Roman name from the story of how he almost single-handedly captured an enemy town that had that name. So he is Coriolanus, in the same way as Scipio Africanus, or things like that. And the reasons, scholars have been all over the map about what this play is and what to do about it. This is, in case you're wondering, This brick, I love it so much. There are so many better collected Shakespeares than this. This is the old running press Shakespeare that has the everything. It has it, and I don't know why. Sometimes you just can't explain these things. I've had many collected Shakespeares, and of course the text that counts here is the second edition of the Riverside Shakespeare, the big brown book. That is the collected Shakespeare to have. I have this one because I just love it. I've always loved this. Every time I read a running press collected Shakespeare into dust, every time it literally falls apart on me because it's a big, heavy book, but it's a paperback. So if you give it strenuous use, it will break apart. And whenever I want to reread a Shakespeare play or part of one, I reach for this thing as opposed to anything else. I have all the individual plays in individual volumes. I have the Riverside Shakespeare. I have, there's another, I think it's the Arden Shakespeare that I have, but this is the one I reach for. So when it falls apart, I get another one. Sometimes I get another one even when one is in shape, so that I can just have one in reserve. But I'm not quite sure why Lukács gave me this play, but it was fascinating to read it again. Even if we didn't know the dates, and I maintain that we don't, but even if we didn't have any dates to guess at all, I believe that we would sort of see this as a late play. I think if you ignore dating completely and you just read Shakespeare, the plays, just read the plays with heightened attention, the kind of heightened attention that you will give them, for instance, if you're teaching them, I think you can sort of chart out when in one creative life these things happened, if they did happen in one creative life. There's all sorts of theories, of course, from the outlandish, which I propounded on this channel, that a lot of these things, or most of them, or all of them, weren't written by Shakespeare, to the status taken by people like A.C. Bradley and more traditional critics, where it's not only Shakespeare, but they can practically picture him at his work table. And for them, they know all the dates, even the seasons of the year. They can find that in allusions in the plays. That is not very sound. No matter how sure a case they sound to make for it, that is not very sound. And then there's a sort of middle ground idea about the composition of these things that I think, the more I think about it, is probably the case, where there were many hands, and Shakespeare were one of them, and maybe the most skilled. So, for instance, when you get to a play, like, for instance, if we assume that Coriolanus is a late play, by this point, Shakespeare would have been mostly retired from the hurly-burly of his hustling early days. He would mostly be considering getting out of theater altogether and becoming just a prosperous and venal landowner. In which case, you would expect two things. If you take that as the way to look at this play, then you would expect two things from Coriolanus. You would expect, one, that its styles vary, that different characters sound like they were written by different people. I think that's less evident in this play than in a lot of other Shakespeare, including a lot of earlier Shakespeare. But the other thing you might expect, if this is a late play, if this is, imagine if it's 1610. I've even seen some critics put this at much later than that, even later than 1610. If it's that late, then another thing you might expect to see in this play, and that we'll see in a lot of other plays in ShakeTube this time around, I can't help but notice, since I've seen the roster of plays. Another thing that you might expect to see here is a bit of, I don't want to say boredom. I don't want to say boredom. Because when I picture Shakespeare, I don't picture him, at his writing table or any of those romantic things. But when I picture him at work, I picture that work was his love, that he loved doing it. So I don't imagine boredom in the strict sense. I have that on the mind because one famous critic said famously of The Winter's Tale that it is the work of a bored genius, where both of those words are meant to haul their weight. And I think bored maybe isn't the word, but certainly restless. I think when you read Coriolanus himself, the character, is like nothing else in Shakespeare. Not really. Not any other character who's human, anyway. He's not like anything else in Shakespeare. And as many critics have pointed out, it's because he doesn't seem to have any interiority, to use the hoity-toity English literature word. He doesn't seem to have any self in the way that just burns like a candle in all of Shakespeare's great characters. He isn't a great character. Instead, he's a great actor. Not in the sense of playing a role, but in the sense of a moving figure. He is a great actor in the events that make up his play. He does things. He very seldom thinks about things. Very seldom ponders things. He just does things. And the most famous scene in the play is one in which his own mother tries to appeal to the inner feelings of a grown man who, for his entire life, she has done her best to extirpate inner feelings in. She has done her best to create a god of war. And now when it turns out that's what she's done, she's trying to appeal to the boy, to the man inside this god of war. And that scene should be Shakespearean gold. And instead, for me, I know it's heresy, it's always failed. That scene has always failed for me. Because the Coriolanus that we know in the play, the Coriolanus that we have heard about, where there's plenty of third-person references back to him in this play as in all Shakespeare plays, that person would not change his mind, even for his mother. Even for children. We wouldn't do it. So I guess the long and the short of this video, I don't want to make my ShakeTube videos too long at first, because I'm doing 3 ShakeTube videos before we all gather together for the last week, and one of my 3 videos is going to cause me to go on a bit long. So I'm going to try to keep these other 2 videos relatively controlled. So I guess my verdict for this ShakeTube video is a bit on the heretical side, which is that I don't think Coriolanus is a particularly good play. I have taught it, and I have told my students ahead of time. I always in my classes on any subject at any level, I always stress to my students, I'm not going to take a company line here. I'm going to tell you what I think, and then we'll go through it, and I will help you to figure out what you think about it, and it doesn't have to be what I think at all. And I would just upfront tell them, okay, now we're going to deal with Coriolanus, and there's a whole bunch of things we want to talk about here. But I want to open by saying I'm not impressed by this play. There are some moments, and there are some wonderful, wonderful phrases. I think this is such a wealth of phrases, great turns of phrase, that has to be the work of Shakespeare. He was better than that than anybody. But I used to tell my students, I don't particularly like this play, and you might. It's often the case that teenage boys will love this play, and it shows. It shows in the performances that this thing has had. It is a perennial favorite for performance for a certain kind of lead actor. There's a certain kind of lead actor who loves to do Coriolanus, who loves to do this play. I have heard from some actors who enjoy this. I heard from them a long time ago. They're long since dead. But I've heard from actors, including a couple in the Royal Shakespeare Society, in the Royal Shakespeare, company, who said this, for a certain kind of lead actor, this is more enjoyable than any other starring role that Shakespeare wrote. And I can sort of see that. I can definitely sort of see that. It allows you to as one old friend of mine used to say, to stretch your trousers on stage. So I would tell my students that, and I'm telling you that as well if you haven't come to Coriolanus. Especially if in school you were exposed to other Shakespeare, typically Macbeth, but also maybe Hamlet or Julius Caesar. If you come from there to here, you're going to notice a change, a very great change. This is Shakespeare writing in a register that is new to him. And like I'm saying, I don't want to use the word boredom, but he might have been restless with the old conventions of his old plays. And if we follow the standard chronology, if we accept it, there is no reason to. I want to stress that. There is no reason to accept the standard chronology. Anyone who tells you otherwise and points to specific parts in this play about the Thames freezing over or whatever is leaving out the stuff that vitiates their point. There is no reason to stick to a strict chronology with this or almost any other Shakespeare play. But if we do, then it's understandable. If we follow that chronology, the William Shakespeare in 1610 would have been saying goodbye to the old hustling world of theater where he made his name. And he did make his name, so, I'm not going to say he wouldn't have to try as hard, but he could afford to innovate. He could afford to make gambles based on the strength of his name and also the increasing attenuation of his connection with whether or not the thing was a success. I think that's rich grounds for genius. And I guess genius is present in Coriolanus. I guess it is. It's just, such an alien genius to me. It is, when I read Shakespeare, when I read his plays, I want to feel, I mean, I want to marvel at the language, absolutely, and I want to absorb that. But I also want to feel that thing, that thump on the inside of, yes, the language has changed, yes, the circumstances and the standards have changed, but oomph. This is an immediately human production. I understand this. I understand this. No matter how alien it is on the surface, I understand it. I get it. That's Shakespeare's genius. That's why people have called him the greatest writer of all time. And I don't see much of that in Coriolanus. I don't actually see much of that in any of the later plays. But we'll get to that, and so will my colleagues. They'll probably have a lot more edifying stuff to say on the subject. I'm a lot more verbose when I'm dealing with a Shakespeare play that I really love. And Coriolanus is not one of them. I'm actually glad for that reason that Lukács picked it for me, because it forced me to go back and reread it, and then read about it, and think about what's here and what's not, what's here and what's not. There's all sorts of dramatic action in Coriolanus, but there's no reason for you to root for anybody. There's no reason for you to care about any of the action. And that is weird. That is weird for Shakespeare. So I'm glad that I did it. I'm glad that I read it, and that we'll see, what the rest of you make. If you're reading along for ShakeTube, then maybe this is your first time encountering Coriolanus. I'm sure that you've encountered, maybe you've encountered big screen movies. There was a big screen movie just recently. I saw this, I've seen this on stage many, many times, most of the time in uncontrollable messes of productions. I saw it in London ages and ages and ages ago when Coriolanus was played by Anthony Hopkins, and he was the only good thing in the play. And oftentimes that is the case, where you will get an actor who wants to stretch his trousers, and he picks Coriolanus because it's one of the easiest ways to do that. And it's but that's going to wrap up my my ShakeTube, my first installment. I will be moving on next time. I forget which play Lukács assigned me for next time, but we'll have fun. We'll talk about it. So I'm gonna wrap that up for now. What's that I hear, Book 2? What's that I hear? You're wondering what Harold Bloom thinks of Coriolanus, are you? Well, as it just so happens, I have Bloom's book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, right here. Couldn't live without it. And he has a lot to say about Coriolanus, and some of it is extremely interesting. Bloom is very much one of those critics who says that we know every month and week of Shakespeare's work calendar, like we had the calendar in front of us. He doesn't really subscribe to impermanence or doubt of date. He doesn't really do that. And I think part of the reason why he subscribes so strongly to knowing every date down to the last season of the year is because he also subscribes to the conceit of Shakespeare as a person. He has invented a Shakespeare as a person that he wants to be real, that he wants to know almost person by person. And you can't do that if the play's datings are up in the air, because if the datings are up in the air, then the authorship's up in the air, and he knows that. And most Shakespearean scholars know that. So Bloom he's just wedded to the idea of knowing exactly when Shakespeare wrote everything. And he sees it also as a late play, and he doesn't come right out and say that it's unsatisfying to read or to watch. But I have to think that he feels that way, and I have a feeling that he thought that way when he taught it. And let's check in with him and see what he has to say, shall we? Part of the immense fascination of Coriolanus for me is that in Shakespeare experienced a sea change and abandoned what had been the center of his dramatic art. No one from Coriolanus on is free artist of himself or herself. Cleopatra, an astonishing act of human invention, was Shakespeare's farewell to his richest gift. And I wish we could surmise why this was, or perhaps had to be. Was Shakespeare weary of his own enormous success in inventing the human? Inwardness, Shakespeare's largest legacy to the Western self, vanishes in Coriolanus, and never quite makes it back in later Shakespeare. Cleopatra's vast inner self dies no ordinary death. She is transmogrified. And so we are left with no occasion for grief or regret. One way of seeing the change in Shakespeare is to contrast Cleopatra's question regarding the fatal asp, will it eat me, with Coriolanus' alone I did it, his final vaunt to the Volsicans. Cleopatra's whimsical, childlike question is endless to meditation and charms us, and fills us with fresh wonder at her personality. Coriolanus' is a boast, is childish, and its poignance is infinitely more limited. That's what Harold Bloom thinks of Coriolanus. he sees it. I mean, he sees it as a limited play, and in that I agree with him. I agree with the master. so we are if we are holding court on Coriolanus and we are producing sentence, we are going to say that it is a late work. It is a strange work. It is Shakespeare starting to amuse himself, which would have been absolute firebrand heresy for the Shakespeare of the great plays, who was constantly in dialogue with his audience and wouldn't have dreamed of amusing himself solely. I mean, he does in all those great earlier plays. He's constantly amusing himself solely, but he wouldn't have dreamed of doing it only that under any circumstances. It's only later Shakespeare where he starts to be writing inside his own head, where he starts to, as one scholar friend of mine put it a very long time ago, where he starts to prefigure novelists who work inside their heads and cannot have come to think they cannot really work in tandem with an audience. But that's another subject. That's another subject for another time, because that's the birth of genre criticism, of genres of fiction. The one of the key distinctions, there was a war of words going on just recently on BookTube about what constitutes literary fiction, as opposed to genre fiction. And much was said, much by me, and one of the things that I would say is that so-called literary fiction does not care about its audience at all. The writer is inside their own head, creating their own world, beating to the beat of their own drummer. Whereas if you're writing a murder mystery, you have to care about what your readers think. If you're writing science fiction, you want your readers to love it. So if we take those things and move them back in the past, in these later plays, I think Shakespeare is moving more towards an inwardness, more towards communing with his own talent. Except for the plays where a strong case can be made that he was just handed a rough work and told, could you Shakespeare this up? In which case there's an element of cooperation there, although anyway, that's the idea of Shakespeare and the birth of genre criticism, of genre fiction, is a conversation for another day. So we'll stick to Coriolanus. This was fun. So ShakeTube 2019 is well and truly launched, and I urge you, despite the a la carte approach that we're taking here, to take in the videos by Lukash and by Jason. They have very different and wonderful approaches to Shakespeare. My approach isn't anywhere near as eggheady as Lukash's, and he is, or Jason's. And they are both very much interested in the prosody. They're very much interested in the dynamics, the rhetorical dynamics of the plays. And I'm mainly just ripped that Shakespeare died owing me money. So you're going to get all kinds of different perspectives, but you're going to love it. So if you're new to ShakeTube, by all means, dig in and watch everything. And the grand finale will be all of us at the end. I haven't figured out what we're going to do. I haven't proposed any ideas. It would be sort of nice if we could somehow, between now and then, master the technology to talk about that final play together in a simultaneous video. I don't have the technical ability to do that, but maybe somebody does. That would be a lot of fun. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. I'll be back next week with my next ShakeTube installment, and in the description of this video, I will put what that is so that you can read ahead. I don't remember at the moment, but it's another play that I wouldn't have picked. Lukash picked one play that I would have picked, and he didn't pick any of the others. So that makes it fun on its own. And the one play he picked that I would have picked, it's going to be a long video. So we'll get to that at the end of the month. So I will see you next week. Thank you, BookTube.